the incentive to produce the best possible technology is still going to be there. We're seeing a contest between two very different value systems, two very different approaches.
Hello and welcome to Chinese Whispers with me, Cindy Yu. Every episode I'll be talking to journalists, experts and long-time China watchers about the latest in Chinese politics, society and more. There'll be a smattering of history to catch you up on the background knowledge and some context. How do the Chinese see these issues? In 2015, China set the target of being a tech superpower by 2025. That is an industrial strategy known as Made in China 2025, and it means that China wants to move into high-tech areas like robotics, AI, biotech, and also semiconductors, those computer chips that go into pretty much everything in modern life, from iPhones to unmanned drones in warfare. But China has actually been lagging behind in this target, and the world's leading manufacturer of these semiconductors is actually based in Taiwan. Given the current geopolitical climate we're in, this technological race has become a geopolitical one, an arms race for the 21st century. That's what I'm going to be talking about in this episode today. My guest is Nigel Inkster, who is a former MI6 director and now a senior advisor on cybersecurity and China for the think tank IISS, and also author of a book called The Great Decoupling, which is all about America and China's respective quests for technological dominance and the decoupling in global supply chains that might come about. Nigel, welcome to Chinese Whispers. To start with, can you explain what is a semiconductor and what are they used for?
Well, semiconductors, to answer the second part of your question first, they're used for pretty much everything these days. There are very, very few machines, devices that are not critically dependent upon semiconductors. They are essentially, in effect, a kind of micro electronic switch. They enable circuits to open and shut, and through that to enable a huge variety of electronic devices to work.
And as I understand it, size matters insofar as the smaller, the better, and the most cutting edge at the moment is about 3 nanometers. Is that right?
Yes, I mean 3 nanometers is just starting to be a production feature. In fact, the vast majority of semiconductors that are in common use are nowhere near that small. Sort of anything from 64 to 28 nanometers is much more common. And the problems that we've been seeing globally in relation to areas like the motor industry, the shortages there are not of these very high-end minute microchips. That they're the much larger, more commonly available. But having said commonly available, the production of these things is in no sense a trivial undertaking.
I mean, it's very expensive, as I understand it, to do each generation, billions of dollars.
Yes. Well, if we're talking about 3 nanometers, to set up a fabrication plant, a fab, as it's termed in the trade, we're talking somewhere between $15 and $18 billion. And once you've actually made that investment, you have to maximize production for as long as possible in order to amortize that investment. It's a very complicated process. You've got to build a fab, you've got to acquire the etching machines, each of which will cost you between $200 and $300 million, and you also need to set up a very complex and sophisticated supply chain in the chemicals and materials that you're going to need to operate the plant. Added to which, if anything goes wrong, shutting down the plant and then reopening it is a major undertaking. It's not a trivial matter, just turning off a switch, turning it back on again. And costs matter. I mean, it's very interesting, for example, that one of the founders of the Taiwanese TSMC corporation, which is manufacturing now at this 3 nanometer production node, gave an interview recently where he talked about relative costs, made the point that in the United States, production costs were persistently and stubbornly 25% higher than in Taiwan, which made the prospect of opening TSMC fabs in the USA a not very attractive commercial proposition, but it is being done more actually for political reasons.
Yes, well, let's definitely talk about that. You mentioned the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is the world-leading company doing these cutting-edge things. Can you give us an idea of the market dominance of them? How good are they? How
Yeah,
important are
well,
they?
I mean, um, just to dial back briefly, most of the intellectual property and design of these microprocessors is done in the United States. But the United States does not now produce many of these microprocessors. I think only about 12% of global supply is actually manufactured in the United States. And most of that is done by one major corporation, Intel. There are only two other games in town when it comes to the very advanced high-end microprocessors, and that is Samsung in Korea and TSMC in Taiwan. And the TSMC fabs in Taiwan specialize in producing other companies' designs. So you've got major design companies in the United States, Qualcomm, Nvidia, etc. They design the microprocessors, and TSMC produces them. Samsung is a kind of intermediate situation because they manufacture for their own devices, but also they make to other people's designs. Intel only, up until now, has manufactured for Intel's own machinery and equipment. So TSMC is unique in that it only manufactures other people's design. And over the years, TSMC has taken massive gambles in investing in this very complex and expensive process, making it, in effect, the world leader. And I think it's very difficult to say categorically, but it's possible that TSMC may account for 60% of the world's most advanced microprocessors. So it is absolutely market critical.
I mean, it's incredible that this chip that is so important to everything in daily
Yes.
life is so
Mm.
market dominated by one factory in, or one company, I should say, in Taiwan. Especially when Taiwan
Mm.
is such a precarious place, which we'll get on to
Well, I
soon.
think the point there is that out of the three major manufacturers of advanced microchips, two are in geopolitically very unstable locations. That's TSMC and Samsung.
Yes, that's true. So, how is it that a Taiwanese company has had such market dominance in doing that then? Is it just because of a globalized world, American companies relying on, there is no reason not to import this kind of stuff if you don't have to put in the cost of manufacturing yourself?
Well, exactly. I mean, and of course, manufacture in Taiwan is, as we just said, very considerably cheaper than in the United States. You
Why,
save
why is
25%.
that?
Well, I think it's just a function of the fact that the United States is, a very high, high cost society, and that impacts on everything. It impacts on the wages you have to pay your workers. It impacts on your taxes. Everything that all the inputs into the process are just that much more expensive in the United States because it is a more developed economy. So yes, I mean, I think it's been one of those situations where Taiwan has identified this area as a kind of area for national, developing a national champion, and this has been a mutually beneficial arrangement. And I think it's important to emphasize that the manufacture of microprocessors is a highly globally integrated system. I mean, you've got, TSMC is manufacturing these things, but it's getting the designs from the United States. It's getting the equipment to etch the circuits from the Netherlands. It's getting chemicals from Japan, from Germany, and the packaging and distribution is actually largely done in China, in mainland China. So the whole thing is hugely integrated.
Yeah, I mean, very symptomatic of the globalized world that we've just gone through in the last few decades, which you in
Exactly.
your book looks at in terms of whether or not it will last. And let's talk about that in a bit. But for now, let's talk about the People's Republic of China.
Yep.
In 2015, the government set up the Made in China 2025 industrial strategy, which is aimed at taking China higher up the values chain when it comes to manufacturing. So, not toys and clothes, but renewables, AI, biotech, and semiconductors. But Nigel, when the industrial policy was first announced in 2015, it had the target of basically meeting 40% of its domestic demand by 2020 for semiconductors and 70% of its domestic demand in semiconductors by 2025. How successful has China been in meeting those targets?
Not very is the short answer. I mean, the fact is that China is investing very heavily in microprocessor production. And huge financial incentives are being offered by different provincial and municipal administration to attract startups to get into this business. But I think since 2015, China's industrial policy has evolved. And I think it's quite clear that under Xi Jinping, the vision for the future is small and medium startups focusing on industrial production. I mean, we're seeing now that Xi Jinping himself is showing very pronounced Marxist tendencies in that he looks at the economy in terms of production and distribution, has little time for or little interest in consumption. And we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years that these consumer-facing mega corporations in China, like Alibaba and Tencent, have come under a lot of government pressure. And the focus now, as I said, is very much on industrial production, developing these capabilities to enhance China's manufacturing and production capability. I mean, there is a phenomenon in China that is referred to as the Gongye the industrial party. It's not, of course, a party. But what it is a kind of loose coalition of young Chinese engineers who see China's future very much in terms of this industrial production. And I think this is a reflection of the way the country is looking at the issue.
When you say industrial production, is that high-tech industrial production as well?
Yes, it is. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. I mean, the aim is to go as high up the value chain as quickly as possible, and to the extent that it is possible, achieve something close to global dominance in the tech sector, the way that the United States has enjoyed that status, for the last 40, 50 years.
So why is it that China hasn't been able to crack that industry then when it comes to semiconductors?
Well, I mean, there are, it's not the only industry where China is still struggling. I mean, aero engines for commercial airliners is another area where China stubbornly fails, to make the grade. But I think the problem is in China that it goes back. I made the point in my book back to the 1960s when China's understanding of transistors and microprocessors was broadly on a par with that of the United States. But following all the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, the disparaging of intellectuals and all that sort of thing, China basically dropped a whole generation of scientific and engineering progress, and it's never really recovered from that. And you've got you do have a lot of very capable young Chinese engineers who are now working in the industry. But the big problem for China at the end of the day is that China has not been able to develop these very advanced ultraviolet lithographic systems that are effectively dominated by two corporations, and actually, in practice, really one, ASML, which is a Dutch corporation. And because the equipment, this deep ultraviolet lithography and now extreme ultraviolet lithography, is so dependent upon US intellectual property, the United States government is pretty much able to dictate the terms on which ASML can sell its equipment to other countries. And we're seeing now the United States government apparently planning to crack down on this to the point where China's MFA press spokesman Zhao Lijian talked about technological terrorism. In terms of the fact that the United States is planning to deny China access to this equipment. And as I said, it's not just the equipment. This is one of these businesses where if you were able to acquire the equipment, if you were able to, so to speak, steal the blueprint, you still wouldn't be there because you don't have the experienced workforce that is going to actually operate this kit. You don't have the supply chains that you need to ensure timely and effective delivery of all the inputs that you're going to need to deliver the appropriate quality. So it is an uphill struggle, and it's not just something that you can solve by throwing money at. And this is a difference. When China wanted to have a network of high-speed rails, it was relatively straightforward. They just stole the blueprints from Japan,
Yeah.
threw money at it, and
Literally stole
eventually,
through espionage.
yeah, they
Or,
did, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and through patience and persistence, they got actually very quickly a national high-speed rail network. This is one of microprocessors are not that sort of technology. There is a German term, Fingerspitzgefühl, literally meaning fingertip feel, which refers to the kind of innate knowledge that is very difficult to explain. It's something you acquire by doing it, and this is a key area where China still is behind.
So time really matters. The amount of
Time
time
does
you've
matter,
had
yeah, absolutely.
for 7
And the
years
other
is not
thing, of
enough.
course, is it's possible that China might be involved in a kind of Zeno's paradox race, where the hare never actually Achilles never actually overtakes the tortoise.
Because
Um,
everyone else is going by so quickly.
Well, yes, and the other point is, of course, we are coming to a point, not yet, but it will happen when, so-called Moore's law, the proposition that the capacity of microprocessors increases roughly every 24 months, will come to an end. Talking about production at the 3 nanometer node. Well, the size of a silicon atom is zero point 0.2 nanometers. Once you hit that, you've nowhere else to go. So there will come a point, at some point, where it's going to be very difficult to etch yet more complex circuitry into yet tinier microscopic slivers of silicon. Now, there are ways around this, moving from electronic to photonic, um, and as a way of optimizing the ability of these small chips to function. There are other materials rather than silicon that could be used. Gallium, an obvious case in point. These things are in the future. But the point is, it is going to be one of these situations where there will come a point at which we kind of run out of road in terms of how we're producing these things at the moment. And the question is, will China ever sort of catch up? And does it make good economic and commercial sense for China to try to do that?
Yeah, I mean, in a globalized world, you can just get your stuff wherever, right? But I think that's a
Well, indeed.
big assumption right now.
Yeah.
But before we move on to the geopolitics, Nigel, some in the West might say that only innovative societies, politically free societies, societies that encourage critical thinking, can do this kind of cutting edge technology. Matt Risley, for example, a Spectator contributor, has a book exactly on this called How Innovation Works. Do you think that's part of China's problem?
It could be. I mean, I think we should, we don't need to. We should be careful about making too easy generalizations about this kind of thing. If you look at the Soviet Union during the Cold War, for example, we saw it was hardly a free society, yet we saw some quite significant technological innovations. Let's say, take the Kalashnikov. The most commonly available firearm in the world. It was a Soviet military officer who decided that he was going to work out how to combine the best features of a rifle and a submachine gun in one item, and that was very successful. In the 1950s, it looked as if the Soviet Union was going to beat the United States in the space race, so on and so forth. So I don't think it's that entirely that straightforward. But at the same time, I do think that there are risks associated with an excessively statist approach to running these things. And I think we're going to see this with China's efforts to dominate global technical standards, which is a major um, focus of the Xi Jinping administration. The way it's working at the moment, we're going to see the state more actively involved in working with industry to develop technical standards. I mean, there is a risk there that if the state gets too much involved, you end up in a situation where you're kind of baking in obsolescence rather than creating the circumstances for genuine continuing innovation. There's a big risk in that.
Can you explain what you mean by technical standards?
All electronic equipment in the world, and this is absolutely everything from the most advanced microprocessors to the device that you plug into the wall to charge your phone. All of these things are designed to internationally agreed technical standards. And the point is, the country that whose technical standards get adopted internationally stands to benefit very significantly, both economically, because every time somebody develops a device using these standards, they pay royalties, and China pays huge amounts of royalties, including to the United States, for things like software. So if you can get the world to accept, or a significant part of the world to accept, that your technical standards are the ones that should be adopted, you benefit economically, both because people are paying you royalties and they're buying your kit, or kit that is designed on your standards. But it goes beyond that, because if you look at the way the internet developed in the 1990s and the 2000s, it had US values baked into it, so to speak. And I think that China would like to see a world in which the next generation of technical standards had Chinese values baked into them. And you see this, for example, with the way in which China sells its communications networks to the developing world. They have all the capabilities for authoritarian oversight and control that are commonplace within China's own networks. And so you get a kind of reinforcing process in which your values, your approach, your way of doing things gradually becomes the accepted global way of doing it.
Yeah, well, I had Jing Tu from Yale University on recently, and her book Kingdom of Characters mentioned the early telegraphy moment, where
Yes.
based on Morse code, it was based on alphabetic English alphabet, and China really struggled with adapting that
Yes.
to its own language. So I guess it's just a modern version of that.
Well, yes, indeed. I'm old enough to remember, I can still remember the Chinese commercial codes for some of the most common Chinese characters.
No, Nigel.
Not many people can any longer do that, nor is it a particularly useful skill.
Helps the little grey cells.
Indeed.
Okay, so let's talk about the geopolitics of the whole thing then, because clearly America and China both see it as a national security issue. Well, actually, can I say that? Can I say clearly that both
Yes.
sides see it as a national security issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair.
Yeah, okay. And so there's an arms race that's happening, and you've already mentioned the American efforts to basically hobble China in its catching up. In your recent book, you've talked about how that race will lead to a great decoupling of tech and supply chains between the West and China. I think listeners have already had an idea of just how integrated and global the whole process is at the moment. So what do you foresee happening then in the next 10, 20 years with this great decoupling?
Well, as the great Yogi Berra once said, never make predictions, especially about the future. But one can see, sort of possible ways in which this situation might evolve. And I suspect that one very likely outcome is a world that is kind of bifurcated, with some countries using US based technological systems, others using um, Chinese systems, and some countries possibly operating a hybrid arrangement where, to some extent they use both, which of course would be highly inefficient, add considerable costs, but may be the way to go. I mean, I'm sure you're aware, that when you go on the Chinese internet, it is already in many ways a very different
Mm.
experience to using, Western internet. It is at once similar, but in other ways very different. And those differences are to a significant degree cultural, rather than technical. The underlying technology is essentially the same. The way it is applied is actually quite different. So, I mean, I think that is one possibility. But I think what we are going to see is what we are already in, and will probably be in for some considerable time, is a kind of messy, undetermined situation in which neither side is going to be in a position to declare victory, to say, well, sort of, we've taken over the world and everybody's going to, do it our way. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of competition going on. It's not always necessarily going to be the best technology that comes out on top, because politics and geopolitics are going to play a very considerable role in all of this. But the incentive to produce the best possible technology is still going to be there. And ultimately, there's a question about whether a status Chinese model can, in the long term, perform better
Mm.
than the US laissez-faire model. And we don't know the answer to that question. For years in the West, we've taken it as an act of faith that the laissez-faire system will always develop better results, that the market, will sort of sort things out. Even though Adam Smith was quite clear that it wouldn't always, and governments would need sometimes to intervene to take corrective action. And so we're seeing a contest between two very different value systems, two very different approaches, and it is absolutely unclear how that is going to play out. In China, it is an article of faith that the Chinese system, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the new era.
With
Um,
Xi Jinping as the call.
yeah,
Getting
exactly.
quite a mouthful now.
Don't you love these sort of snappy, appealing, titles they come up with? Yeah, the must prevail, and that is, that has been very, very clearly and repeatedly stated. Um, we will see.
But can I push back on that, Nigel, and say
Yeah.
that the American government is getting quite involved when it comes to
Mm.
technology and certainly
Yes.
semiconductors? We've already talked about export controls. That doesn't just
Yes.
apply to American companies. As you say, they're pressuring the Dutch government and the Japanese governments to not
Hmm.
supply China with the relevant components in this industry.
Yeah.
As I understand it, the Arizona plant that TSMC is opening came about from political pressure from the Trump administration. So
Absolutely.
the government is putting its oar in, and
Yes.
do you think that obviously that's a Trump era legacy, but it doesn't look like Biden's going to overturn any successive American governments.
Well, that seems to be an issue under debate within Washington at the moment. At the moment, it's rather narrowly focused on whether existing Trump tariffs should be maintained or whether some of them should be lifted, whether it would be in U.S. interest to do so. But yes, I mean, I think that the I mean, again, every country has its national myths, and the United States national myth is one of untrammeled free enterprise. It's never been like that since the 1890s. When Roosevelt brought the oil companies and the banks to heel. Ever since then, the United States government has been ready to intervene as and when necessary. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we've seen. There is a bill going through Congress at the moment called the United States Competition and Innovation Act that provides for, I think, $250 billion in funding, most of which is designed to ensure that the United States can remain competitive vis-a-vis China. And actually, this is seen in China as such a threat that China has threatened unspecified retaliation if this act is passed into law, which I think it very well will be, albeit not in its current form. So yeah, I mean, the U.S. government is getting very actively involved. It's used the entities list, an arrangement which was designed to prevent equipment and know-how going to countries to develop weapons of mass destruction programs, to deny access to Chinese companies of U.S. Technology and inputs. And we're seeing, if anything, that restrictive approach broadening under Biden. And the mood within Washington, within the Beltway, is such. I think it would be very difficult for any administration to suddenly turn around and say, let's make nice with China. This is just not, a realistic political possibility in today's America.
Well, is it also effective insofar as, when it comes to semiconductors, one victim, Chinese victim, has been Huawei, which was subject to export controls in the chips that it needed. Has that worked? Has it been working?
Yeah, well, and certainly it has kneecapped Huawei's mobile technology sector, and Huawei has had to move into other areas, cloud computing being the main one. So yes, I mean Huawei definitely was very badly affected by what the United States did. China's 5G networks are moving ahead, but perhaps slower than they would otherwise have done. The United States is now rolling out 5G networks, so most people I know who've got them say there's no perceptible difference from 4G. Actually, that was to be expected to start with. When you get a new generation of mobile technology, the way it evolves is very dependent upon the so-called vertical use cases.
Right.
So, when you get this technology, how it evolves, how it develops is critically dependent upon how key industries and key actors choose to utilize it and develop it. So it's still in a sort of fairly embryonic state in that respect. But yes, I mean, what the US has done vis-a-vis Huawei and other, is now planning to do with other Chinese companies is going to have an impact, and no question about it. But of course, that only takes you so far. Yes, you can slow China down, but then can you speed America up? That is actually the more important question to answer, because if all you're doing is sort of kneecapping your opponent but not actually running in the race, you're ultimately not going to achieve very much. And this, I think, is my big worry, is that if we do end up in this progressive technology decoupling, I think everybody is going to be a loser. I don't think there are going to be winners in this competition, because to date these technologies have been so dependent upon global integration, the interchange of ideas, and if we're going to end up dealing with two sealed systems, well, we know the second law of thermodynamics tells us what happens in a sealed system. You get entropy.
Brilliant. But Nigel, surely in this race, America has the upper hand. I'm playing devil's advocate here, in that it's got its own know-how, it's got a Taiwanese manufacturing, and soon it will have it in its own country in Arizona. As you mentioned, Samsung is the second market leader. That's South Korea's American ally. Surely in this kind of race, just on semiconductors alone, America has the upper hand.
Well, America does have the upper hand at the moment. It's still several generations ahead of China in terms of design, and for the reasons we've talked about, it's actually going to be quite difficult for China to catch up. I suspect something similar may be going on with artificial intelligence. That one is more difficult because what we talk about, when we talk about AI, which we tend to actually use it as shorthand for machine learning. This stuff is still actually very fragile and unpredictable in the way that it works. But I think that the United States retains a corpus of expertise here that China cannot yet match. Indeed, it remains the case that the majority of Chinese experts in AI aren't actually working in China; they're working in America. So there are issues here.
Although the Americans are trying hard to get them to go back to China. They don't
I
want
know,
those
yes,
Chinese
indeed.
experts.
Well, nobody ever said that Western governments are not capable of acts of, self-destruction.
Self-kneecapping.
Indeed, yes. I mean, let's look at Brexit as an example of that.
Let's not get on to Brexit.
No.
And what about rare earths? Is that something? I mean, am I right in thinking that rare earth is a fundamental material that is needed for semiconductors, and China controls, I think, 80% of the world supply?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, rare earths, the term rare earths is a bit of a misnomer because these things aren't actually that rare.
Oh, okay.
They're quite abundant and quite widely distributed. America's got lots of them. So has Canada, so has Australia. There are other places within the US sort of geopolitical orbit that have these things. The problem with these rare earths is that they are extremely dirty and polluting to produce. And until recently, China has been the only country that has been willing to shoulder that cost.
But also in Africa, right? Chinese companies in Africa.
Well, I mean, some of these raw materials, I mean, lithium in particular, the cobalt, the focus has been, these have been coming from Africa, from the Democratic Republic of Congo in particular. But there are other countries, in Latin America, I mean, countries like Chile, Bolivia have got significant deposits of these minerals. As I said, the real problem is the processing, which is expensive, dirty, polluting. China's doing a lot of this production in Mongolia, which has kind of large swathes of land that nobody's ever going to live on. So it's a relatively kind of it's relatively speaking easier for them to take that hit. But the United States was the country that first started to mine and process rare earths, actually as a byproduct of other more conventional mining operations. And if they're prepared, to assume the risks, the environmental costs, they could perfectly well produce these things for themselves. So I think it unlikely that China is going to remain, retain a chokehold. In fact, a few years back, China did withhold supplies of rare earths from Japan in retaliation for something the Japanese did. I can't remember what. And in fact, what happened was that the Japanese just resourced those rare earths, and the net result was that China simply lost market share.
Okay.
So it's more complicated than that. Having said that, of course, the fact that China does have such a high percentage dominance in the production of these things does give it some leverage, no question.
Yeah. And the ultimate thing that China can do, which we've been quite good at not mentioning so far, but is invading Taiwan and overtaking TSMC. So I think some
Well,
people in
yes,
Washington are worried about that.
I think they are. Yes, I mean the Taiwanese tend to blithely say, "Oh, well, this is our silicon shield." China would never take the risk of seeing the TSMC fabs destroyed, in order to retake the island. I'm not persuaded of that at all. I think, like a lot else to do with Taiwan's attitude towards its own defense, there's a certain delusional element there. Um, but the fact is that the TSMC fabs, um, are a source of potentially serious risk. And the question is, in an invasion, in a violent invasion scenario, um, would the Taiwanese government, would the United States um, be ready to destroy these fabs rather than let China get hold of them? I
Mm.
mean, if we look at an analogous situation, Switzerland in the early 1940s, everyone assumed that Nazi Germany was going to invade. The Swiss sent a message to Berlin saying, if any German forces cross our border, our army will destroy the country's industrial infrastructure, blow the dams, flood the central plains, and take to the hills to conduct guerrilla warfare. So, faced with the prospect of acquiring a totally unproductive and useless piece of real estate, Hitler opted not to invade. Now, Taiwan potentially could do something similar, but so far it hasn't.
Do we have any signal from Washington or Taipei that it is thinking about doing it, that it might lean towards that as a policy?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Do you think it's actually a deciding factor, a carrot for China to invade Taiwan? Is there something that could change?
Well, you would think so, but I've not seen any discourse to that effect. So I think it's an open question. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not saying, I'm not claiming to have all the answers here, particularly in relation to a country as opaque as China is. I've just not seen any, publicly articulated discourse around this issue.
Do you think that in this decoupling scenario that could happen, if China is not getting the chips from TSMC anyway,
Mm,
it may
mm.
as well just invade? If America pressures this kind of decoupling to the extent that
Yeah.
China can't get
Well,
its
I
components.
I mean, I think there may be a strain of thought which says, effectively, the one thing China has got in its favor is that it does manufacture a very significant proportion of the world's less sophisticated
Mm.
microprocessors, from the sort of 24 nanometers sort of upwards, as it were. And there could be a kind of Erostratus kind of mindset, Erostratus being the guy who decided he was going to seek notoriety by burning down the Temple of Diana at Ephesus. It is possible that the Chinese might say, right, well, if we can't have it, nobody can have it. And even if we lose this, we will still be able to manufacture at the higher production nodes, and this will give us a kind of strategic advantage.
Yeah.
Now, that is a possible train of thought. As I've said, I've not heard this articulated.
Of course. And I also want to bring it back to the UK because in the UK now, Nigel, you and I, we've spoken about the live political question over the acquisition of Newport Wafer Fab by a
Yes.
Chinese company.
Yeah.
It's a Welsh semiconductor manufacturer, and basically the government did a national security review of it. Stephen Lovegrove concluded that it was not a national security concern. Kwasi Kwarteng, the business minister secretary, told him to go back and look again.
Do better,
Are you
yes.
sure? Because
Yes.
clearly, politically, if China acquires, the argument goes, if China acquires a manufacturing capability, and it is part of Made in China 2025 that it is creating national champions, but also acquiring foreign manufacturing. So it is part of the strategy that it could, it feels like the West is shooting itself in the foot. Why would the UK let that happen? But
Yeah.
you expressed doubt about it when we last talked about it. Can you explain
Well,
why?
I think that the Newport doesn't manufacture very high end, very advanced microprocessors. I think the issue in relation to Newport may be less one of national security than UK industrial patrimony. how does it make sense to lose this kind of capability? Because once lost, it's not easy to get it back. And I think one of the things people are beginning to wake up and realize about deindustrialization in the West, in the United States, in Europe, is that with deindustrialization comes a loss of expertise, culture, workforce skills that are very difficult to recover. So I think the question is probably less, is this a sort of security dagger poised at the heart of UK national security, or is it a question of the advisability of the UK losing, these skills and capabilities? And I think it's more that.
But I think national security as a term has been broadened now, hasn't it, in this arms race world that we're in?
Absolutely. I mean, Xi Jinping's concept of comprehensive national security, effectively incorporates everything.
Perhaps as it should.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is the reality. I mean, we've seen a progressive expansion of what people think of as meaning national security. And, not long ago, it was very narrowly defined in terms of, sort of largely sort of military focus. But, concepts of security have been significantly evolving since then, and continue to do so.
And you also previously mentioned that Newport Wafer Fab actually was doing quite low end stuff.
Yes.
When it, can you give us an idea of just how
I
advanced
think
it is
it. I
or
think
not?
I'm not absolutely sure, but I think the best they can do is 28 nanometers. I
Okay.
think, but I'm,
So is that what the
I
Chinese can already do themselves anyway?
which they already do. Yeah,
Right, I see.
exactly.
Okay. And Nigel, just finally, seeing as I have you here, I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent 10th House joint speech by the heads of
Yes.
MI5 and the FBI. For listeners who
Yes.
don't know, the Director General of MI5 and the director of the FBI said that they had more than double the effort against Chinese activity of concern, and that China poses the biggest long-term threat to national security for the West. It's made headlines, as
Yes.
perhaps it should, because it is quite an exceptional joint speech. But at the same time, these are things that we already knew, didn't we? I mean, as a former intelligence officer, I would have wondered what you thought about
Well,
the speech.
well, yeah, you and I know about this because, of course, we follow these issues very closely. But I think, I mean, I don't know exactly what the motivation was for this joint presentation. But what I strongly suspect is that it reflects a perception by both the FBI and and MI5 that the threat from China is growing unmanageably large. And in order to deal with it, there needs to be an important exercise in public consciousness raising, because I think the Chinese have been quite adept at operating within sort of grey areas. And in the United Kingdom, in particular, activities like elite capture, sort of paying senior retired people large sums of money to occupy sinecures, and then use them to either promote China's points of view, or maybe also help gain access to things that China wants. And there's a lot of concern about engagement between academic institutions, universities, and so on, in which there is a risk of important technology leaching away. All of these factors come into it. So I think it's not. I think that a lot of people tend to assume that the sort of real espionage threat in the United Kingdom sort of comes from countries like Russia using very traditional techniques and tradecraft. China has, Chinese intelligence services have a looser approach to things like tradecraft, and indeed, intelligence collection is not just the preserve of China's intelligence agencies. Lots of other entities are involved. The point I made in my book, Great Decoupling, is that China, we need to think of China to some extent as an intelligent state, in much the same way as the Venetian Republic was in its apogee in the 16th and 17th century, when intelligence collection and covert acquisition was kind of built into the fabric of the state, such that almost anybody could find themselves involved in intelligence work. And I think we're seeing something similar now in China. And conveying an awareness of that, alerting people to the potential risks of getting involved in what on the face of it seemed like innocuous activity. I think this is the real message that McCallum and Ray were trying to put across.
Fascinating. Nigel, we must have you back on the show just to talk about espionage, of course. Nigel Inkster, thank you so much for joining Chinese Whispers.
A pleasure. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you for watching this episode of Chinese Whispers. If you've just come across the podcast on YouTube, you can find more episodes through searching for Chinese Whispers wherever you get your podcasts from. There is a brilliant backlog of episodes not on YouTube. And if you have feedback, do leave a comment below, preferably constructive. And subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel so you never miss any of our Spectator TV shows. Thanks for watching.